again, people think this is hyperbolic when I say things like this, and I'm going to justify what I'm about to say with a lot of data, facts, and history of cycles. But I've got a chapter in my book, and the title of the chapter is The 2020s, the most important decade in our civilization's history. And I genuinely believe that. I think the 2020s is going to be the most interesting decade of human history. We, right now, are living through this monetary transition that we're talking about. Okay, we really zoom out. Right now, we're at the end of an 80-year long-term debt cycle. Historically, these kind of things unwind in 10-year chapters. Their unwinding began in 2020. We can see there's lots of data backing this up. Hirschman Capital, massive hedge fund, they ran a report looking back at the past 225 years of data, and they said that once a government reaches 130% debt to GDP levels, typically that government defaults on its debt within 15 years. So they found that there's a 98.6% probability of a government defaulting on its debt within 15 years. So they looked at 52 governments, 51 of them defaulted on their debt. The way governments typically default on their debt, they don't say, hey, we're over indebted, sorry, pack up the game. They say, we're over indebted, we're going to steal your money. And we're going to do that through taxation, capital controls, printing money out of the wazoo. Okay, very simple. You print money, you devalue the existing money, you pay back your old debt with the devalued dollars. Okay, this is how governments default. 51 out of 52 times this has happened since 1800. We default in 15 years. America, the global reserve currency holder, hit that 130% debt to GDP level in 2020. I don't want to get into the weeds. I don't want to get into the rabbit hole, but there's a lot of data there suggesting that, hey, we're at the end of this 80-year long-term debt cycle. We're also at the end of this 90-year fourth turning cycle. I believe we're also in the transition of this 250-year revolutionary cycle. We're also at the end of this 50-year tech cycle that began in the 1770s. And we are just right now, we're in a decade where all of this chaos and cycles just seem to be unwinding. And I think, again, it's really interesting because you can look at technology adoption cycles. And this is where things get really wonky with Bitcoin. And this is why I call Bitcoin the economic singularity. It's been the working title of my book for 3 years that I still haven't published. But Bitcoin technologies get adopted in exponential waves. Everybody knows that. So if we look at the technologies, I'm going to tie all this together, I promise. If you look at the technologies, automobile, the internet, and the smartphone, on average, took them 12 years to go from 0 to 10% adoption. Very slow growth in those first 12 years. You hit an inflection point, and then adoption goes exponential. And on average, those three technologies, they went from 10% adoption to 90% adoption in the same 10-year window that it took them to go from 0 to 10% adoption. So again, I think that's an interesting mental framework for Bitcoin. Bitcoin's 16 years old today. You can measure Bitcoin adoption in lots of different ways. That's a different rabbit hole that I could talk about for 5 minutes pretty comfortably. But I kind of think it's interesting that I think Bitcoin's kind of showing signs over the past 4 years that it's in this new era. For the first time in Bitcoin's life, coins have been leaving the exchanges precipitously for 5 years, since 2020, when I think the big money realized what Bitcoin was. So I do think it's interesting that I think Bitcoin is kind of coiled to go through this period of exponential adoption in the 2020s. Who knows what date, what time, what year? I don't know when it's going to happen. I do think it's going to come quicker than most people think. And it kind of aligns with all of these other cycles. Because what is the solution to an 80-year long-term debt cycle that we're living through the unwinding of? Sound money. What is the solution of a 90-year fourth turning cycle where you see a lot of political instability, riots, capital confiscations like we saw in the previous fourth turning in the 1930s? Again, what did FDR, Mussolini, and Hitler all want to do? They wanted to steal your money. And this is always why these fourth turning cycles always kind of coincide with these 80-year long-term debt cycles. Again, what's the solution to a fourth turning for the individual and the nation state? It's Bitcoin. It's sound money. Then you look at the technology, K-wave cycles. So if you look since 1770, we've had new revolutionary technologies created every single 50 years that have fundamentally transformed the global economy. Industrial revolution, steam engines, railways. Then we had electricity and steel. And then 50 years later, we had the automobile and the oil revolution. And after that automobile and oil revolution in the early 1900s, 50 years later, what happened? The invention of the microprocessor. This obviously drove the entire digital wave that we saw, the internet bubble in the early 2000s. But what comes 50 years after the early 1960s? It's around the 2010 era. What was a technological revolution that we're living through today that's going to transform the global economy over the next 50 years? Some people think it's AI. Some people think it's 3D printing. Some people think it's encryption. I fundamentally believe it's Bitcoin. So I think Bitcoin is also the solution or the thing that happens every 50 years. We see these technological revolutions. And lots of people have made videos saying, is Bitcoin the fifth industrial revolution, the fifth technological revolution in these waves of tech innovations that happen every 50 years? And I fundamentally disagree. I actually don't think it is. I actually think it's much bigger. And again, in my book, I've made the case that Bitcoin is actually far more akin to the industrial revolution. And Bitcoin is actually going to create the next era of 250 years of growth for the digital realm, kind of like the industrial revolution did in the early 1770s. Again, 250 years ago, our civilization was pretty amateur, not very advanced. We were literally living in dirt, living in villages, banging rocks together 250 years ago. There were no megacities, there were no factories, no machines, no cars for thousands of years, if not millions of years. The top moving speed that our civilization achieved was like 3 to 4 miles per hour. That's how quick you could be on the back of a horse. And that was the quickest we could figure out for millions of years, right? Over distance. Okay, yes, you could run faster than 3 miles an hour for 100 meters, but over distance, that's the quickest we could move as a civilization. All the way up until the 1770s. Then we create steam engines. Then we create cars. Then we create rockets. And in only 160 years, our civilization's top speed over distance went from 3 miles per hour to something like 25,000 miles per hour when we launched a rocket to the moon in the 1960s. This just goes to say people don't understand exponential change. And I really do think Bitcoin's a lot bigger than most people think. It is the industrial revolution for cyberspace, for the digital realm. It is also the next sequence, it's the next thing in this 250-year revolutionary cycle we see. So what's interesting is every 250 years, we see a big revolution. So in the early 1500s, a technology, the printing press, created the separation of church and state, the Gutenberg printing press. All it did was decentralize and democratize information for everyone. 250 years later, exactly 250 years later, from the 1520s to the 1770s, we saw the two largest revolutions in human history, French and American Revolution. What's 250 years forward from the 1770s? It's the 2020s. I think it's awfully poetic, and I just think Bitcoin is just like the printing press. It's going to do something very similar. It's going to separate money from state for the first time in human history, the same way the Gutenberg printing press separated the church and the state in the 1500s. So I think, like, it's a long answer, but I think what we're living through right now, it's unprecedented. It's huge. It's big. It's a once-in-a-species transition. And again, most people really aren't zooming out and thinking about Bitcoin within this much broader context.
Only you can say it that well. That's for sure, Luke. It's truly remarkable the time we're living in, and it's, eventually we're going to get to a point when this is all happens, fiat's gone, and you can only work for Bitcoin or mine it. That's it. In saying that, I would love for you to touch on life getting cheaper in Bitcoin. This is something that, again, you briefly touched on earlier. 0.1 Bitcoin being something where you could retire on 0.1 Bitcoin, or maybe it's 0.01 Bitcoin, or maybe it's 1 Bitcoin, but everything in life getting cheaper in terms of Bitcoin, and where fiat, everything keeps getting more expensive. in the Bitcoin standard, on a Bitcoin standard, as you save in Bitcoin, life continues to get cheaper for you, and understanding deflation and how that really works. And we have these competing systems right now. So I'd love for you to unpack this and how you explain to talk to the people about this.
If you want the answer to that question right there, and you like that spicy clip, check it out here. Come on, we'll see you in there. But if you want the full interview in its entirety, all the spicy clips put together, and you're not going to want to miss it, believe me, then check that out here. Come on, we'll see you in there. Do it.